A teenage boy struggling to make ends meet stumbles upon a lost, disoriented stranger in the park. What begins as a small act of kindness, a simple sandwich, unfolds into a life-changing journey of redemption, forgiveness, and hope. But what secrets does this stranger carry? And how does one boy's compassion ignite a spark that transforms an entire town? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The evening air was heavy with the smell of fried food and stale coffee as Ethan Grayson pushed open the door of the diner. The jingling bell above announced his departure to no one in particular. His shift had ended hours ago, but he stayed late to help clean up after a busy Friday night. He tightened his grip on the plastic bag in his hand, holding a modest sandwich and a bottle of water, a makeshift dinner he'd brought for himself. The streetlights cast a faint glow over Willowbrook's main road, their flickering bulbs a reminder of the town's slow decline. Ethan adjusted the straps of his backpack, his shoulders aching from a day of carrying trays and washing dishes. He glanced at his watch. Nearly 8:30. He was late picking up Maggie's medication from the pharmacy, and the store closed at 9. He quickened his pace, the soles of his scuffed sneakers barely gripping the cracked pavement. As he passed by the local high school, a group of teens gathered near the entrance, their laughter cutting through the quiet. Ethan kept his head down, his grip tightening on the bag. "Hey, Grayson," one of them called out, their tone mocking. Ethan didn't turn, but the sharp sound of their voices followed him. "Nice shoes," another shouted, and the group burst into laughter. Ethan felt the heat rise to his face, but said nothing. His shoes, held together with duct tape and hope, were an easy target. He bit the inside of his cheek, focusing on the path ahead. He didn't have time for this. Maggie was waiting. The park came into view as he rounded the corner, the dim light of the street lamps barely illuminating the benches scattered along the walking trail. That's when he saw him, an older man sitting alone on a bench, his shoulders slumped and his head bowed. His clothes were worn and wrinkled, and his hair, a stark white, glowed faintly in the moonlight. The man's hands rested on his knees, and his gaze was fixed on the ground, as if he'd forgotten how to look up. Ethan slowed his steps, glancing at the man from a distance. Something about him felt off. He looked lost, vulnerable. Ethan hesitated, his feet rooted to the spot. He had a million reasons to keep walking. He was running late. Maggie needed her medication. He hadn't eaten since lunch. But none of those reasons felt strong enough to override the pang in his chest as he looked at the man. "Are you okay, sir?" Ethan finally called out, his voice cautious as he approached the bench. The man lifted his head slowly, his eyes cloudy and unfocused. He blinked at Ethan as though trying to place him. I'm not sure," the man said, his voice trembling. "I think I was going somewhere." Ethan sat down on the edge of the bench, still gripping the bag of food. "Do you live nearby?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle. The man shook his head faintly. "I don't remember," he murmured, his fingers twitching slightly. Ethan glanced at the bag in his hand. The sandwich wasn't much, a simple turkey and cheese on white bread, but his stomach churned at the thought of giving it up. He thought of Maggie, her voice echoing in his head. "Kindness isn't about convenience, Ethan. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard." He swallowed hard, then reached into the bag and pulled out the sandwich. "Here," he said, holding it out. "You look like you could use this more than me." The man's eyes widened, and for a moment he hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached out, his hands trembling as they took the sandwich. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're very kind." Ethan watched as the man unwrapped the sandwich with shaking fingers, taking small bites. He noticed a photograph peeking out of the man's coat pocket, a black and white image of a young woman with a bright smile. "Is that your family?" Ethan asked, nodding toward the picture. The man paused, his gaze dropping to the photo, his expression softened, a flicker of recognition lighting up his face. "My daughter," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Maria." There was pain in the way he said her name, as though it carried the weight of years of regret. Ethan didn't press further. Instead, he stayed seated, watching as the man ate in silence. The sound of a car horn in the distance jolted Ethan out of the moment. He glanced at his watch. 8:50. Panic surged through him. He was going to miss the pharmacy. "I need to go," he said, standing up abruptly. There's a shelter a few blocks from here. They'll help you find your way." The man looked up at him, his eyes clearer now, though still tinged with sadness. "Thank you," he said again, his voice firmer this time. Ethan nodded and jogged off, the bag of water swinging in his hand. He barely made it to the pharmacy in time, skidding to a stop at the counter as the clerk began locking the door. Breathless, he handed over Maggie's prescription slip. On his way home, the events of the evening replayed in his mind. He thought about the man on the bench, the sorrow in his voice, and the warmth of gratitude in his eyes. Ethan didn't know what the man's story was, but he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. As he unlocked the door to his small house and stepped inside, the familiar scent of lavender greeted him. Maggie was sitting in her armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly. She looked up, her face lighting up with a tired but genuine smile. "Hey, Ethan," she said. "You're late." "Yeah," Ethan replied, setting the bag on the kitchen counter. "Sorry, Ma, just helping someone." Maggie tilted her head, her smile growing. "That's my boy." Ethan returned her smile, though his mind lingered on the man at the park. He didn't know it yet, but that small act of kindness would set in motion a series of events that would change everything. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains in Ethan's bedroom, painting the walls in soft hues of gold. He rubbed his eyes, still heavy with sleep, and groaned as he stretched. Another day awaited, filled with school, work, and the ever-constant care for Maggie. As he got ready, Ethan couldn't shake the image of Derek Harlan from his mind. The man's frail figure, the haunted look in his eyes, and that photograph. All of it lingered like a half-finished thought. In the kitchen, Maggie was already awake, humming a faint melody as she shuffled through a cabinet. Ethan's heart tightened at the sight of her. She wore the same housecoat she had for years, its once vibrant floral pattern now faded. "Morning, Mama," Ethan greeted with a warm smile, using the nickname he'd called her since childhood. Maggie turned, her face lighting up. "Morning, my boy. Did you sleep well?" Ethan nodded, pouring himself a cup of instant coffee. "Yeah, you eat breakfast yet?" She waved a dismissive hand, her attention already drifting to something unseen. "Oh, I'll get to it." Ethan set a plate of toast and jam on the table, making a mental note to remind her to eat before he left. At school, Ethan found it hard to focus. His mind kept wandering back to the park bench and the crumpled photograph in Derek's hand. He wondered what had driven the man to such a lonely place. By the time his last class ended, Ethan decided to stop by the shelter before his shift at the diner. The small building stood at the edge of town, unassuming but vital for people like Derek. Inside, the faint hum of conversation filled the air. Volunteers moved efficiently, passing out meals and blankets to those in need. Ethan scanned the room and spotted Derek sitting at a table in the corner, staring absently at his hands. "Mr. Harland," Ethan called softly as he approached. Derek's head lifted, and for a moment his face brightened with recognition. "Ethan," he said, his voice steadier than the night before. "You came back." Ethan pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "I just wanted to check on you. How are you feeling?" Derek offered a small, grateful smile. "Better. They've been kind here. Gave me a warm meal, a place to rest." He hesitated, glancing down at the photograph he still clutched tightly. Ethan followed his gaze. "You carry that with you everywhere, don't you?" Derek nodded, his expression softening. "It's all I have left of her. My daughter, Maria." The name hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Ethan leaned forward, sensing the weight of Derek's words. "What happened between you two?" For a long moment, Derek didn't answer. His fingers traced the edges of the photograph, as if drawing strength from it. Finally, he sighed. "I made mistakes," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "When her mother passed, I buried myself in work. I thought I was doing the right thing, providing for her, giving her a stable life. But I wasn't there for her when she needed me most. We grew apart, and by the time I realized it, it was too late." Ethan hesitated, then reached out, his hand resting lightly on Derek's. "Maybe she's just waiting for the right moment. Don't give up on her." Derek's lips curved into a faint smile. "You're wise beyond your years, Ethan. Thank you." As Ethan walked back through the park, the evening air turned crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine. He thought about Derek's story, about the daughter who might still be out there, waiting for reconciliation. He pulled out his phone, briefly contemplating looking up the name Maria Harland. But what would he even do with the information? It wasn't his place to interfere. Still, the idea gnawed at him. When he arrived home, the house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the heater. Maggie was sitting in her recliner, knitting something incomprehensible but happy in her work. "Mama," Ethan said as he dropped his bag by the door, "what would you do if someone you loved drifted away? If you thought they didn't want to see you anymore?" Maggie looked up, her eyes soft but sharp, with a wisdom that hadn't faded. "I'd remind them that love doesn't disappear just because time passes. Sometimes people need space, but that doesn't mean they have stopped caring." Her words settled deep within Ethan, resonating like an unspoken truth. "Thanks, Mama," he said softly, leaning down to kiss her on the cheek. The evening cast long shadows across Willowbrook, the town settling into its quiet rhythm. Ethan unlocked the front door of his modest home, the familiar creak of the hinges greeting him. Inside, the house felt colder than usual, despite the heater humming faintly in the corner. "Mama!" he called out, setting his backpack down by the door. There was no answer. His pulse quickened as he stepped into the living room. Maggie's knitting basket lay untouched beside her recliner, the television flickering with static in the background. A faint rustling noise from the kitchen made him turn sharply. "Maggie?" Ethan's voice softened as he walked toward the sound. He found her standing by the pantry, clutching a can of soup as if it were something precious. Her hands trembled, and her gaze seemed far away. "Mama," Ethan said gently, approaching her. "What are you doing?" She turned to him slowly, her eyes glassy with confusion. I was looking for your grandfather," she murmured, her voice tinged with desperation. "He said he'd be back soon, but it's been hours." Ethan's chest tightened. He took the can from her hands and guided her to the kitchen table. "Mama, Grandpa's been gone for a while now," he said softly, sitting beside her. "You remember, don't you?" Her expression shifted, a flicker of realization crossing her face before it crumbled into sadness. "Oh, Ethan, I forgot again, didn't I?" Ethan reached for her hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "It's okay. You don't have to worry about that. I'm here, and I'll take care of everything." Maggie nodded, her lips trembling. "You've grown up so fast, Ethan. Sometimes I wish you didn't have to." The weight of her words pressed heavily on him, but he forced a smile. "I don't mind, Mama. You've always been there for me. It's my turn to be here for you." After helping Maggie to bed, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the soft glow of the overhead light illuminating the stacks of unopened mail. Bills, reminders, and a notice about an overdue utility payment stared back at him. He let out a sigh, resting his head in his hands. His mind was a whirlwind of worries. School assignments he'd neglected, the hours he needed to cover at the diner, and, most recently, Derek Harland. The photograph Derek carried flashed in his mind again. The young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Maria. Ethan wondered if Derek felt the same way Maggie did, adrift in a fog of memories, searching for something just out of reach. His thoughts turned to his own family. He remembered the nights when his parents were still alive, when laughter filled the house and the future seemed brighter. After their accident, Maggie had stepped in without hesitation, becoming both mother and father to him. Her unwavering love had been his anchor, even as dementia slowly unraveled the strong, vibrant woman she once was. "Don't let this world make you forget that," Derek's words echoed in his mind. Ethan stared at the photograph tucked into his notebook, the one he had taken discreetly while Derek wasn't looking. A part of him felt guilty for doing it, but another part couldn't let go of the idea that Maria needed to know her father was looking for her. Ethan's phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. It was a text from Lucy, his coworker at the diner. "You okay? You seemed off tonight." Ethan smiled faintly, grateful for her concern. "I'm good, just thinking about some things. Thanks for checking in," Lucy replied almost immediately. "Anytime. See you tomorrow?" "Yeah, good night, Lucy." He set the phone down and looked out the window. The stars twinkled faintly, their light barely piercing through the town's faint glow. For a brief moment, Ethan allowed himself to dream of a different life, a life where Maggie was healthy, the bills were paid, and the weight on his shoulders wasn't so crushing. But that wasn't his reality. The morning sunlight crept through the cracks in Ethan's curtains, accompanied by the soft hum of activity outside. Willowbrook was waking up, but Ethan barely registered the sounds as he rushed through his usual routine. With Maggie still asleep, he had just enough time to pack his backpack and grab a piece of toast before heading out for school. As he stepped out the front door, his worn sneakers scuffing against the cracked pavement, something stopped him in his tracks. Parked across the street was a sleek black sedan, its polished surface glinting in the sunlight. It was a sight completely out of place in their humble neighborhood. Ethan froze, his heart skipping a beat as he noticed the driver's side door open. From the car stepped Derek Harland, now wearing a tailored suit that seemed to transform him into an entirely different person. His demeanor was calm, almost regal, as he scanned the area before locking eyes with Ethan. "Ethan," Derek called out, his voice steady but warm. He crossed the street with purposeful strides, his polished shoes clicking against the asphalt. Ethan's mind raced. Why was Derek here? And why did he look so different from the lost man on the park bench? He tightened his grip on his backpack, unsure whether to feel anxious or curious. "Mr. Harland," Ethan greeted cautiously as the man stopped a few feet away. What are you doing here?" Derek smiled faintly, though there was a seriousness behind his eyes. "I wanted to thank you. What you did for me the other night, most people wouldn't have bothered. You didn't just feed me, you treated me like I mattered." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "It wasn't a big deal. You needed help." Derek studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You remind me of someone I used to know, someone I should have been there for when it mattered." Ethan didn't know what to say. He glanced at the car, its engine quietly purring, as if waiting to whisk Derek away at any moment. "I wanted to learn more about you," Derek continued. "I asked around, found out where you lived. I hope you don't mind." Ethan's stomach churned. The idea of someone like Derek delving into his life felt invasive, but the man's tone wasn't threatening. If anything, it was tinged with regret. "I don't really have much going on," Ethan said, his voice tight. "Just school, work, and taking care of my grandma." Derek's expression softened. "And yet, you still had the heart to help a stranger. That says a lot about you." Ethan hesitated, unsure how to respond. "What do you want from me?" he finally asked, his voice more direct than he intended. Derek's lips twitched into a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I don't want anything from you, Ethan, but I do want to help. For years, I've carried the weight of mistakes I can't undo. I've lost things, people, I'll never get back. But meeting you, it felt like a second chance." Ethan blinked, his confusion only growing. "What do you mean?" Derek reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. He extended it toward Ethan, his gaze unwavering. "What's this?" Ethan asked, not taking it. "It's for your grandmother," Derek said simply, "to help with her medical expenses." Ethan stared at the envelope, the weight of the gesture sinking in. He could feel the tension coil in his chest, the mix of gratitude and pride warring within him. "I can't take that," Ethan said, shaking his head. "My grandma wouldn't want charity." "It's not charity," Derek replied firmly. "Think of it as gratitude. You gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time. Kindness. This is my way of paying it forward." Ethan hesitated, his fingers twitching at his sides. He thought of Maggie, of the mounting bills stacked on the kitchen table, and the long hours he spent at the diner just to keep their heads above water. "Take it," Derek urged, his voice quieter now, "for her." Slowly, reluctantly, Ethan reached out and took the envelope. It felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried not just money, but an unspoken promise. "Thank you," Ethan murmured, barely audible. Derek nodded. "One more thing," he said, his tone shifting slightly. "I'd like to meet your grandmother, if that's okay." Ethan hesitated. Maggie was fiercely independent, even in her current state, but something in Derek's request felt genuine, almost earnest. "Okay," Ethan said finally. "But she's not always herself." Derek smiled gently. "Neither am I. I'd still like to meet her." Maggie was seated in her recliner, knitting something only she understood, when Derek stepped into the small living room. He paused, taking in the modest surroundings, his gaze lingering on the family photographs lining the walls. "Maggie," Ethan said, his voice soft as he approached her, "this is Mr. Harland. He wanted to meet you." Maggie looked up, her hands stilling, her eyes focused on Derek, and for a moment there was a flicker of recognition, though Ethan couldn't imagine why. "Mr. Harland?" Maggie repeated, her voice slow but clear. You look familiar, Derek smiled faintly. Maybe I remind you of someone? Maggie's lips twitched into a smile. Maybe. You have kind eyes. Ethan watched the exchange in silence, his chest tight. It was a rare moment of clarity for Maggie, and he didn't want to interrupt. You've raised a good boy, Derek said, his voice steady but warm. You must be very proud. Maggie nodded, her smile widening. He's my heart, she said simply. Derek glanced at Ethan, his expression unreadable. I can see that. Outside, Derek turned to Ethan, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. You're a remarkable young man, Derek said, and your grandmother is extraordinary. Don't ever doubt that. Ethan nodded, unsure how to process everything. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Derek's gaze hardened, but not unkindly. Because I've spent too long watching from the sidelines. Maybe it's time I did something that mattered. Without another word, he stepped into the black sedan and disappeared down the street, leaving Ethan standing on the sidewalk, clutching the envelope and feeling the first spark of something unfamiliar. Hope. The envelope rested on the kitchen table, unopened. Its presence seemed to fill the small room, demanding attention that neither Ethan nor Maggie was ready to give. Ethan sat across from Maggie, his hands clasped tightly together, the weight of Derek's gesture pressing heavily on his chest. Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her cup of tea. You said he just showed up? She asked, her voice both curious and cautious. Ethan nodded. Yeah, he wanted to thank me for helping him that night. Said he wanted to pay it forward. Maggie glanced at the envelope again. It's a kind offer, but kindness can come with strings attached, Ethan. I know, Ethan replied. That's why I haven't opened it yet. I don't want to make the wrong choice. Maggie's gaze softened as she reached across the table, placing a hand over his. You've always had good instincts, Ethan. Trust them. The hours at the diner dragged by as Ethan replayed his conversation with Derek in his mind. Between taking orders and clearing tables, he couldn't stop thinking about the man's words. Maybe it's time I did something that mattered. When his shift ended, he found Derek waiting for him outside. The black sedan gleamed under the dim glow of the streetlights, and Derek leaned casually against the car, his hands in his pockets. Ethan, Derek greeted as the boy approached, his tone warm but firm. Got a minute? Ethan hesitated but nodded, shoving his hands into the pockets of his jacket. What's up? I wanted to talk about the envelope, Derek said, motioning for Ethan to join him on a nearby bench, and about what it represents. Ethan sat, his posture guarded. It's generous, but I'm not sure if it's right for us to take it. Derek leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I understand your hesitation, but this isn't just about money, Ethan. It's about creating opportunities. For you, for your grandmother, for people who deserve more than what life has handed them. Ethan furrowed his brow, unsure where Derek was going with this. I run a foundation, Derek continued, his voice steady. It's dedicated to helping underprivileged youth find their footing, giving them the tools they need to succeed. I think you'd be a perfect fit. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. Me? Why? Because you understand what it's like to struggle, Derek said simply. You know what it means to put others before yourself, to work hard even when the odds are stacked against you. That's rare, Ethan. And it's exactly the kind of perspective my foundation needs. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. What would I have to do? Work part-time with us, Derek explained. Help out with community projects, mentorship programs, things that would let you make a difference while also learning skills for your future. Ethan hesitated, the weight of the offer sinking in. And what about my grandma? What happens to her? Derek's expression softened. The foundation would cover her medical expenses. She'd get the care she needs, and you'd get the chance to build something for yourself. It sounded too good to be true. Ethan's instincts told him to be wary, but there was something genuine in Derek's eyes, something that made him want to believe this could work. I don't know, Ethan said finally. I need time to think about it. Derek nodded, standing. Take all the time you need. Just know that the door is open whenever you're ready. Back home, Ethan sat with Maggie at the kitchen table, the envelope still unopened between them. He explained Derek's offer, trying to keep his voice steady even as doubt crept into his mind. Maggie listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. When he finished, she let out a long breath. "It's a big decision, Ethan, but it sounds like he believes in you." Ethan looked down at his hands. "I don't know if I can do it, Mama. What if it's too much? What if I mess it up?" Maggie reached out, cupping his cheek. "You've never backed down from a challenge before, and you're not alone, Ethan. Whatever you decide, I'll be right here with you." Her words gave him a sense of peace, but the decision still loomed large. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he thought about everything Derek had said. The foundation, the opportunities, the chance to give Maggie the care she deserved. It all felt overwhelming, but also possible. Ethan walked to the diner with a sense of purpose. He still didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let fear hold him back. After his shift, he found Derek waiting for him again, this time with a folder in hand. "I'm in," Ethan said before Derek could speak. "But I have one condition." Derek raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "I don't want charity," Ethan said firmly. "I want to earn this." Derek's lips curved into a smile, his eyes gleaming with respect. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The first day at Derek's foundation was a whirlwind for Ethan. The sleek office building stood at the edge of Willowbrook, its modern facade starkly different from the rest of the town. Inside, the space buzzed with quiet efficiency. Staff members hustled between desks, phones rang softly, and the faint aroma of fresh coffee lingered in the air. Ethan felt out of place in his thrift store button-up shirt and worn-out sneakers, but Derek's warm welcome at the entrance eased some of his nerves. "Ready for your first day?" Derek asked with a smile. "As ready as I'll ever be," Ethan replied, trying to mask his apprehension. Derek clapped him on the shoulder. "You'll do great. Let me introduce you to the team." Derek led Ethan down a hallway lined with photos of smiling children and community projects, evidence of the foundation's impact. They stopped outside a glass-walled office where a young woman sat typing furiously on her laptop. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, and her sharp features were softened only slightly by the faint glow of the screen. "Maria," Derek said as he opened the door. The woman looked up, her expression immediately hardening when she saw him. "What do you want, Derek?" she asked coldly, her eyes flicking briefly to Ethan before returning to her father. Ethan froze, sensing the tension crackling in the air. Derek's smile faltered, but didn't fade entirely. "This is Ethan Grayson," he said, gesturing to Ethan. "He'll be working with us part-time." Maria leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "So now you're hiring teenagers? What's the angle this time?" "It's not an angle," Derek said evenly. "Ethan is here because he's earned it. He's got a good head on his shoulders and a lot of potential." Maria raised an eyebrow, her gaze scanning Ethan as if she were trying to size him up. "I'm sure he does," she said, her tone skeptical. "But that doesn't explain why you're so invested." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. I just want to help out," he said quietly, feeling the need to defend himself. Maria's expression softened slightly at his words, but the guardedness in her eyes remained. "Fine," she said, turning back to her laptop. "Just don't expect me to clean up after your messes, Derek." Derek exhaled through his nose, clearly holding back a response. He glanced at Ethan, his smile returning. "Let's get you settled in." Ethan was assigned to help organize a mentorship program Derek's foundation had been running for years. The program paired local teens with volunteers who could guide them through career planning, college applications, and personal growth. As Ethan sifted through files and schedules, he found himself fascinated by the stories of the kids who had benefited from the program, stories not so different from his own. By lunchtime, he was beginning to feel more comfortable. The other staff members were kind and encouraging, and the work felt meaningful in a way he hadn't expected. But one thing lingered in the back of his mind. Maria. Her frosty demeanor toward Derek puzzled him. There was a clear rift between them, but he didn't know the details. All he knew was that it ran deep. Later that afternoon, Ethan was tidying up a supply closet when he heard someone approach. He turned to see Maria standing in the doorway, her arms crossed and an unreadable expression on her face. "You don't have to pretend you're okay with this," she said bluntly. Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Maria stepped closer, her eyes narrowing slightly. "My father. He's good at convincing people he's doing the right thing. But trust me, Ethan, he's not always what he seems." Ethan hesitated. I don't think he's perfect, he admitted, but he's trying to help. And, honestly, I need the help. Maria studied him for a long moment, her gaze softening. You're honest. That's rare around here. Ethan shrugged. I don't know about that. I just want to do right by my grandma. At the mention of family, something flickered in Maria's eyes. Pain, perhaps, or regret. She leaned against the doorframe, her voice quieter now. My dad wasn't always like this, you know? There was a time when he cared more about us than anything else. But then my mom died, and he buried himself in work. He thought money could fix everything. Ethan listened intently, recognizing the raw emotion in her words. Do you think he's trying to make up for it now? He asked. Maria scoffed lightly, though her voice wavered. Maybe, but it's hard to forget the years he wasn't there. Ethan nodded, understanding more than he expected. I guess people don't always know how to fix things the right way. They just try. Maria looked at him, her expression softening further. You're different, Ethan. Don't let him turn you into a tool for his redemption. I won't, Ethan said firmly, but maybe he deserves a second chance. Don't we all? Maria didn't respond immediately, but there was a hint of something in her eyes, perhaps doubt or hope that hadn't been there before. With a small nod, she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. Ethan's days quickly filled with a new rhythm. Mornings were spent at school, afternoons at the foundation, and evenings balancing homework, Maggie's care, and his shifts at the diner. The weight of his responsibilities felt heavier than ever, but the work at the foundation gave him something unexpected, a sense of purpose. Ethan's growing involvement with the foundation didn't go unnoticed at school. While most of his classmates ignored his efforts, a few couldn't resist sneering. The group of boys who mocked him before found new ammunition. Look at Mr. Big Shot, one of them jeered during lunch. Hanging out with rich people now. Think you're better than us, Grayson? Ethan kept his head down, focusing on his tray of meager food. But the words stung, especially when they came from people who had no idea what his life was really like. Later that day, as he walked to the foundation, he couldn't shake their taunts. The doubts that had been creeping in grew louder. Was he doing this for the right reasons? Was he just being used as a pawn in Derek's attempt at redemption? One afternoon, Ethan arrived home to find Maggie sitting on the living room floor, her knitting strewn around her. She looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. I couldn't find the pattern, she whispered. I thought I had it, but... Ethan's chest tightened as he knelt beside her. It's okay, Mama, he said, helping her to her feet. Let's get you settled. After ensuring she was comfortable in her chair, Ethan sat on the couch, his head in his hands. The strain of everything, school, work, Maggie's care, was beginning to crack his resolve. That night, as he stared at the ceiling, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of failure. He was trying so hard, but it never seemed to be enough. The next day at the foundation, Derek noticed Ethan's exhaustion. He called him into his office, a sleek but modest space filled with books and framed photographs of past foundation events. You look like you got the weight of the world on your shoulders, Derek said, gesturing for Ethan to sit. Ethan hesitated but eventually sank into the chair across from him. It just feels like, no matter how hard I try, I can't keep up. There's always more to do, more to fix. Derek leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. Ethan, let me tell you something I've learned the hard way. You can't do everything alone. Trust me, I tried, and it cost me more than I ever imagined. Ethan frowned. But I don't have a choice. If I don't step up, who will? Derek's voice softened. Stepping up doesn't mean carrying it all by yourself. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let others help you. The words lingered with Ethan long after their conversation ended. That evening, Ethan sat with Maggie at the kitchen table. Her hands were steadier as she worked on her knitting, and her eyes held a clarity that had been missing for weeks. Mama, Ethan said tentatively, what would you think if I asked for help sometimes? Maggie looked up, her expression warm. Ethan, you've always been strong, but even the strongest people need someone to lean on. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Ethan nodded, her words easing some of the tension in his chest. The next week brought a turning point. Maggie's health took an unexpected dip, and Ethan rushed home from the foundation to find her slumped in her chair, unresponsive. Panicked, he called an ambulance, his hands trembling as he explained the situation to the dispatcher. The ride to the hospital was a blur, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. At the hospital, a kind nurse reassured him that Maggie would stabilize with the right care. But as Ethan sat by her bedside, he couldn't shake the fear that he was losing Derek, arrived at the hospital not long after. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his presence steadying. "She's a fighter, Ethan, just like you." Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving Maggie's face. I can't do this without her." "You won't have to," Derek said firmly. "You've got more people in your corner than you realize." In the days that followed Maggie's hospitalization, Ethan found himself navigating uncharted territory. For so long, he had carried the burden of responsibility on his own shoulders, reluctant to let anyone share in the weight. But this time, something shifted. Derek had insisted on helping, making arrangements with the hospital to ensure Maggie received the best possible care. Ethan had protested at first, his pride flaring up, but Derek's firm yet gentle assurance silenced him. "This isn't charity, Ethan. It's support, and you deserve it." Maria, who had been a distant figure up until now, surprised Ethan by stepping in. She visited the hospital with him, bringing along folders filled with resources for caregivers and contacts for specialists. She was efficient and composed, though her guarded demeanor never fully faded. As they sat together in the hospital's small waiting room one evening, Maria broke the silence. "You remind me of myself," she said abruptly, not looking at him. Ethan blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" Maria sighed, flipping through one of the folders in her lap. "When my mom got sick, I thought I had to handle everything. I wanted to prove I could do it all, be strong, independent, but it almost broke me. I didn't let anyone help until it was too late." Ethan looked down at his hands, her words cutting through his own stubbornness. "It's hard to let people in," he admitted. "Feels like I'm failing if I do." Maria finally met his gaze, her expression softening. "It's not failure, Ethan. It's survival. You can't pour from an empty cup, and trust me, the people who care about you want to help. They just don't know how unless you let them." Her words stayed with Ethan long after she left that night. He realized how much he had been pushing himself to the brink, unwilling to admit he needed help because he thought it made him weaker. But seeing Maggie in that hospital bed, so fragile yet so full of life, made him question everything. If he didn't take care of himself, how could he truly take care of her? The foundation staff also stepped in, offering not just their resources, but their time. One afternoon, Lucy, a volunteer Ethan had worked with on the mentorship program, sat with him in the hospital cafeteria. "You know," she began, stirring her coffee, "you've done more than most people twice your age. It's okay to let others take the wheel for a while." Ethan gave her a weak smile. I don't know how to step back." "Start small," she said with a shrug. "Let someone else pick up groceries. Ask for advice instead of figuring everything out on your own. You'd be surprised how much people are willing to do if you just ask." Over the next few days, Ethan tried to take their advice. He let Maria handle some of Maggie's appointments, trusted Derek to coordinate the financial details, and even leaned on Lucy for moral support when the weight of it all felt too heavy. It wasn't easy. Each request for help felt like peeling away a layer of his pride, but the relief that followed was undeniable. Ethan visited Maggie every day after school and work, bringing her small things to brighten her room: a soft blanket, a framed photo of their family, a book of poetry she used to love. With each visit, Maggie seemed to grow stronger, her sharp wit occasionally cutting through the haze of her illness. One evening, as Ethan sat beside her bed, Maggie reached for his hand. "You're looking less tired these days," she said with a faint smile. Ethan chuckled softly. "That's because I've had help. Derek, Maria, even some people from the foundation. They've been incredible." Maggie's fingers tightened around his. "Good. I'm glad you're letting them in, Ethan. You've always been so strong. But strength isn't about doing everything yourself. It's about knowing when to lean on others." Ethan nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "I think I'm finally starting to understand that." Maggie's smile grew, her eyes twinkling. "You're going to be okay, my boy. And so will I." Step by step, Ethan began to trust that he didn't have to carry everything alone. He saw the strength in letting others help, in accepting their support as a way to keep moving forward. For the first time in a long while, the weight on his shoulders didn't feel insurmountable, it felt shared. The event room at Derek's foundation buzzed with anticipation. Tables were set with pamphlets, chairs arranged neatly, and banners overhead declared, "Mentor Willowbrook's future. Together, we thrive." Ethan stood at the center, gripping a clipboard, nerves tightening his stomach. This was it, the night his mentorship program would either take off or crumble. Ethan's goal was simple: connect teens with mentors from the community to rebuild the sense of belonging that Willowbrook had lost. Local tradespeople, retired teachers, and small business owners had wisdom to share, and Ethan believed their guidance could help teens like him find a way forward. "We all need someone to believe in us," Ethan had told Derek. This program could make that happen. The room filled quickly, and Derek nudged Ethan toward the microphone. "You've got this," he said with a reassuring nod. Ethan took a deep breath, his voice shaking slightly as he began. "Good evening. My name is Ethan Grayson, and I'm here because I believe in this town. Willowbrook has been through tough times, but tonight, I want to talk about what's possible when we come together." He described the mentorship program with passion, sharing his own struggles and how support from others had made all the difference. As he spoke, he caught glimpses of familiar faces, his coworkers, a few classmates, even some of the boys who had mocked him. For once, they were listening. "This program isn't about me," Ethan said, his voice steadying. "It's about us. It's about reminding each other that no one has to face life alone." The applause that followed was overwhelming. Ethan stepped back, his heart pounding with relief, as Derek gave him a proud nod. As the event wound down, people came forward to volunteer, retired nurses, carpenters, and teachers all offering their skills. Maria, usually reserved, stepped in as a coordinator, helping organize sign-ups and directing people with surprising ease. Ethan felt a swell of pride and gratitude as he saw the town rally around his idea. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something bigger, something that could make a real difference. Outside, under the clear night sky, Ethan found Derek leaning against his car. "You did good tonight," Derek said simply, his voice filled with pride. "Do you think it'll work?" Ethan asked, still unsure. Derek smiled faintly. "It already is. One idea, one person willing to try. That's all it takes to spark change." Ethan nodded, letting the words sink in. He glanced back at the building, where volunteers were still packing up. "I just want it to mean something." "It does," Derek replied, "and so do you." When Ethan returned home, Maggie was waiting for him, her eyes bright. "How did it go?" she asked. "It went better than I could have hoped," Ethan said, sitting beside her. She smiled, squeezing his hand. "I knew it would. You've always had a way of bringing people together." Ethan felt a sense of peace as he sat with her. The road ahead would still be hard, but for the first time, he truly believed they weren't walking it alone. The mentorship program had sparked a wave of optimism in Willowbrook, but for Ethan, the most surprising change was the growing connection between Maria and Derek. The strained dynamic between father and daughter was still palpable, but small moments hinted at the possibility of reconciliation. One afternoon, as Ethan finished organizing supplies at the foundation, he overheard a heated conversation in Derek's office. The muffled tones of Derek's voice were followed by Maria's sharper, more defensive replies. Ethan hesitated, unsure if he should interrupt, but before he could decide, Maria stormed out, her face flushed with frustration. "Ethan," she said abruptly, spotting him, "walk with me." Ethan grabbed his jacket and followed her outside, where the crisp autumn air seemed to cool her temper. They strolled silently for a few moments before Maria spoke. "You ever feel like you're trying to forgive someone, but they just make it harder?" she asked, her tone laced with frustration. Ethan considered her words carefully. "I guess. But maybe forgiveness isn't just for them. It's for you too." Maria shot him a skeptical look. "Did Derek put you up to this?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I just know what it's like to hold on to stuff for too long. It doesn't help anyone. Sometimes, letting go is the only way to move forward." Maria's expression softened as she processed his words. "You're wiser than you look, Ethan." He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Or maybe I've just had to grow up too fast." Later that week, Derek invited Ethan to his office for what seemed like a routine check-in, but as they talked, the conversation veered into more personal territory. "Maria and I used to be close, Derek admitted, his gaze distant. When her mother was alive, we were a family. But when we lost her, I didn't handle it well. I thought burying myself in work would fix everything. But all it did was push Maria away. Ethan listened intently, sensing the deep regret in Derek's voice. Have you told her that? Derek shook his head. I've tried, but words don't seem to mean much anymore. She needs to see it, not hear it. Ethan leaned forward. Then show her. Keep showing her. It's not too late. Derek studied him for a moment, a faint smile crossing his face. You really are something, Ethan. The next mentorship event brought an unexpected opportunity for Derek and Maria to connect. Ethan had organized a workshop on career planning, inviting local professionals, including Derek, to share their experiences. Maria had agreed to oversee logistics, though she'd made it clear she wasn't there to play nice with her father. During the event, Derek was paired with a young mentee who reminded Maria of herself. Driven, intelligent, and carrying the weight of family expectations. Watching Derek patiently guide the teen through questions about her future, Maria saw a side of him she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge in years. After the event, she approached him hesitantly. You were good with her, she said, her voice quieter than usual. Derek looked up, surprised but pleased. Thanks. She reminded me of someone I used to know. Maria's lips twitched into a faint smile. Maybe you're not as bad at this as I thought. A few days later, Maria showed up at the Foundation's office with a stack of files. I thought I could help streamline the mentorship sign-ups, she said casually, avoiding Derek's surprised gaze. Derek nodded, his tone careful. I'd appreciate that. As they worked side by side, the silence between them felt less strained. Derek took the opportunity to share a memory of Maria's childhood, one of her first school plays, where she'd stolen the show as a stubborn but endearing princess. To his surprise, Maria laughed, the sound genuine and warm. I'd forgotten about that, she admitted, her voice soft. Mom always said I was born to be the boss. Derek chuckled. She wasn't wrong. The conversation flowed naturally after that, each shared memory borrowing acting as a small bridge between them. By the time they finished their task, the distance between them felt a little smaller. That evening, Maria lingered in the Foundation's parking lot, waiting as Derek locked up. When he approached her, she took a deep breath. Dad, she began, the word feeling unfamiliar on her tongue. I've been angry with you for a long time, and I think I had a right to be. But I'm starting to see that you're trying, and maybe it's time I start trying too. Derek's eyes glistened, and he nodded slowly. I'll never stop trying, Maria. You're my daughter, and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. They stood in silence for a moment, the cool night air wrapping around them like a quiet embrace. It wasn't a full reconciliation, not yet, but it was a start. From a distance, Ethan watched the scene unfold, a small smile on his face. He didn't know all the details of their history, but he could see the progress, and if there was one thing he'd learned through his own struggles, it was that progress, no matter how small, was worth celebrating. The first crisp breeze of winter swept through Willowbrook, carrying with it a sense of renewal. It had been months since Ethan first met Derek on that fateful night in the park, and though the challenges hadn't disappeared, the air around him felt lighter, hopeful. Maggie's treatment, now fully funded by Derek's foundation, had stabilized her condition. The vibrant woman Ethan had known as a child began to reemerge, her mind sharper and her spirit brighter. One evening, Ethan returned home from the foundation to find Maggie humming a tune in the kitchen. A warm aroma filled the small house as she stirred a pot of stew, the old recipe book propped open beside her. You're cooking? Ethan asked, his voice tinged with surprise and delight. She turned, a mischievous twinkle in her eyes. Don't look so shocked, young man. I've been meaning to show you I've still got it. Ethan laughed, crossing the room to hug her. You've always had it, Mama. As they sat down to eat, Ethan felt a rare sense of peace. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. At the foundation, Ethan's mentorship program had become a cornerstone of Derek's mission. Teens from across the town had joined, finding guidance and support from mentors who had once been strangers. The program wasn't just changing the lives of its participants, it was reshaping the fabric of the community. Ethan watched with pride as one of his peers, a shy girl named Lily, shared her dream of becoming an engineer during a mentorship session. Her mentor, a retired machinist, listened intently, offering both advice and encouragement. Seeing her light up like that, Ethan told Maria later, it reminds me why I started this in the first place. Maria nodded, her respect for Ethan evident. You've done more than start something, Ethan. You've given this town something to believe in. The once tense relationship between Derek and Maria had softened. They still had their moments of conflict, but there was a newfound willingness to listen and understand. One afternoon, Ethan found them in Derek's office, poring over plans for a new community center. They spoke easily, their laughter filling the room as they debated paint colors and floor plans. You two are getting along, Ethan observed with a grin. Maria rolled her eyes playfully. Don't get used to it, Derek chuckled, but there was warmth in his voice as he said, we're figuring it out, one step at a time. Ethan couldn't help but feel a swell of gratitude. Seeing their bond rebuild was a reminder of the power of persistence and the possibility of second chances. On a chilly Friday evening, the foundation hosted its biggest event yet, a celebration of the mentorship program's success. The town gathered in the community hall, which was decorated with twinkling lights and filled with the hum of conversation. Ethan stood at the podium, his heart racing as he looked out at the crowd. Maggie sat in the front row, her smile radiating pride. Derek and Maria stood off to the side, their expressions encouraging. Thank you all for being here, Ethan began. When this program started, I didn't know if it would work. I didn't know if people would believe in it or in me. But what I've learned is that it's not about one person. It's about all of us, coming together to create something bigger than ourselves. The applause was thunderous. As Ethan stepped back from the microphone, Derek approached him, holding an envelope. This, Derek said, his voice carrying through the room, is for you and Maggie, a way to ensure that you both continue to thrive. Ethan opened the envelope to find a certificate of ownership, a deed for their small house, paid in full. Tears welled in his eyes as he turned to Derek. I don't know what to say. Just say you'll keep making us proud, Derek replied, his own voice thick with emotion. In the months that followed, Willowbrook continued to transform. The mentorship program expanded, reaching beyond the town's borders. Maggie spent her days gardening and tutoring neighborhood kids, her health steadily improving. Derek and Maria began co-leading the foundation, their bond stronger than ever. As for Ethan, he found himself dreaming of a future he once thought impossible. With the support of the foundation, he applied to colleges, eager to study social work and continue the mission that had changed his life. One quiet evening, Ethan sat on the porch with Maggie, the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, the sacrifices, the struggles, and the unexpected kindness of a stranger. You've come a long way, Ethan, Maggie said, her voice filled with pride. We both have, Ethan replied, smiling at her, and I think the best is yet to come. Thank you for joining me for this story. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel. To stay updated on the heartfelt stories I'm passionate about sharing, your support means the world to me and motivates me to keep creating. I'm truly grateful to have you on this journey with me.